Hello and welcome to another Creative Process video. Last week I had a chance to play a show at the Satosphère. Satosphère is a dome in Montreal which has 157 speakers to allow you to play sound anywhere in the room. For this performance I needed to put the accent on spatial movement, which is something I've been working with a few years but only in the virtual world. So for this show I wanted to keep it similar to my normal live set. So drums and synths, but since the acoustic is not the best in this dome, I decided to use electronic drums using the sensory percussion sensors and my modular synth. I had to choose a program or plugin to allow me to send the sound in 31 outputs, and I was suggested to use SpatGris3, which is a free plugin that's created from the University of Montreal as the end mixer before sending it into the room into all the outputs. In this dome and in the software, you can have different trajectories per track. So these are different movements for the sound to move in the room. My modular synth usually has two outputs because it's left and right. So I had to figure out a way to make these two outputs into more outputs or into more tracks, so that I could have different trajectories in the space to fill out the dome better, but also to have different movements in the room. For this reason, I ordered a controller called the Twister by Midi so that I could have some control over parameters in my computer, but using a hardware unit. In order to have more inputs to move through the room, what I did is I took both left and right inputs from my modular synth, and I had some modules going hard left, some hard right, so that there would be a bit of separation between both channels. And I multiplied these channels times 4 in my DAW. So now I had like right, 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 left, 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 left. And on each different track, I put different effects so that there would be distinct differences in sound between the trajectories. So to be able to improvise movement in the space while also improvising the music, what I did is I separated different groups of tracks into different movements. So let's say I could have my lower sounds slowly circling around the bottom, while I had more sparse high sounds moving very quickly at top, and other sounds which were maybe mid-range crossing the room like this. And so these were automated beforehand, and I copy-pasted that automation on hundreds of hours to make sure that it would always be continuous. The reason I placed it over hundreds of hours is because I was using my Midi controller to control the BPM. This means that I could have some movement going around, and I could stop it by putting it at the lowest BPM. It would almost freeze the sound or the movement. And when I would crank up the BPM, it would start moving quicker. And then for each trajectory, so that I wouldn't have all the sound all the time, I placed a utility plugin before each track, and I mapped my MIDI controller to the gain. So all tracks or effects were always at 0. And when I want, I can open my modular synth sound into that effect, and that effect will be placed in space depending on what effect it is and what trajectory. And then I had the mapping to the BPM to make that movement quicker or slower. And I also had a dedicated knob for the wideness of the sound, which means how many speakers it uses. So in the dome, I could have a sound that's very precise. And if I wanted to be more enveloping or immersive, I would then widen the sound to use more speakers. And last thing, for the technical setup, I also had placed an LFO on the wideness of the height of the sound so that it would always be in movement, like if it was breathing. And so I had my modular synth going into Ableton, going into that spatial mixer. And parallel to this, I had sensory percussion sensors going into the sensory percussion software, going into the spatial mixer. The reason I did both separate into the mixer rather than sensory percussion going into Ableton into the mixer is for latency issues. Technically, what I did for sensory percussion is each drum has a left and right. So that's already 4 channels that I can spatialize because there's left, right, and left, right. So I would hard pan sounds left or right. Sometimes within the same region of the drums, I would cycle samples on each hit, and some would be left, some would be right. So that sound would always be in movement in the room. And then I had 2 effect sends, which both have a left, right. So that's 4 other outputs that each have their trajectory in the space. And for the effect sends, what I did is I placed an LFO on the pan so that it would always be randomly going left to right, which in the dome meant it was jumping from a trajectory to another. So that even if it was static or slowly moving, it would always be bouncing in the room. So that was the technical part of the setup. So modular synth, 2 outputs. These 2 outputs multiplied in Ableton each have a different effect. The lower effects are slowly moving at the bottom, medium effects are moving a bit quicker in the center of the dome, and then at the top of the dome I had the more high pitch or distorted effects moving very quickly. And then parallel with that I had sensory percussion with the same type of stuff. So kick and snare, which often had reverb or with more lower sounds, were placed at the bottom, very large, and the effect sends, which was often delays with distortion and stuff like that, were placed at top. And every parameter is always a bit in movement and never perfectly, never a perfect circle or never a perfect line. There was always some variation in everything, so that the room would have this breathing movement for it to be more organic and immersive for the listener. Now I'll show you the different sounds in my modular synth and in sensory percussion. So for my modular setup, I patched it very similar to how I do in my solo performances. So the first thing I did was create very long loops of sounds and put them into Rample. These samples were based off songs from my previous albums. So I created loops of maybe 10 minutes, and some of them I altered a bit so that it would fit better in the set. So maybe I EQ'd them so that it would fit with the other sounds, or I added some reverb so it would be more lush and smooth. Or for some, like Wanderlust 2, which was the first song of the set, I copy-pasted some sections. I made a drone at the beginning so as a sort of intro on which I could build, and I made it play back slower. So these sounds were in Rample, and so here's an example. After that, I also had some sections of my songs saved into Instro. So I use Instro as either an additional layer for the other sounds or as a buffer, as a transition. So while I was changing other parameters, either in sensory percussion or Rample or other stuff in the modular synth, I could use Instro as a buffer just so that the sound would be continuous in the room while I set up the next piece. Here's an example for Instro and some variations. After this, I also had as an option data bender on a FX send. So to that I was sending Rample, and data bender was going back into my system and then being sent to the other FX send, which was my reverb. This gave me the choice to have either a dry sound of Data Blender or a reverb sound. My reverb was being modulated from her mod via MIDI, mostly on the size of the room, which had a very slow LFO in order to get like this pitchy effect of waving in and out of the pitch. Here's an example of that. So here's the specialization plugin, SpatGris3. The white squares are the speakers, and the sound sources will be round balls. For the top two rows of my controller, each knob is a trajectory. The four ones at top are from the left side of the Modular Synth, and the second row is from the right side of the Modular Synth. Each knob simply controls the gain in the utility plugin, so this decides what amount of signal I send from the Modular Synth into the effect of that track. So this sound should appear on your left side. And now the right side. I'll make it slowly move around your head. The bottom knob on the left side decides the BPM in Ableton. So as I said earlier, if it's completely at the minimum, it will be 20 BPM and it will be almost stagnant. And it can go up to 999 BPM, which would be very quick. The knob right over that decides the wideness of the sound, so to use more speakers for one source. So it decides if it's very precise in space or more diffused over the surface. Now I'll go through all of the effects. So the first iteration of the left side is an octave down, a lot of reverb, and I cut off a lot of the top frequencies so that it would be more of a like low frequency feeling. Here's how it sounds. The second iteration, or the third knob, is one with shimmer, and it's placed around the top of the dome. The fourth knob is distortion, and this sound is also at the top of the dome, moving in different directions. Also, on each effect, I put a small delay or a short reverb, just so that when I close a knob quickly, it doesn't cut off right away. It still has a tail to fade out in the space. For the second row, which is the right side of the Modular Synth, I started off with the clean signal with the delay, and then the second knob is a tremolo, and I made it so that the speed of the tremolo would become quicker at the same time as the gain. Third knob is the same thing or similar at different speeds, but an octave lower. The fourth knob is a very glitchy sound, which comes in and out, and this one can move across the space very quickly, and it's like appearing at different spots of the dome around the top center. So during the performance, all I had to do was to start off by creating textures in the synth and then send them through effects. And I could then control the sound, the frequencies, the movement, the feeling of being enveloped by the sound. And I always had to keep in mind the source, so the modular synth, how to affect that. So it was basically having my modular synth system twice. One source going through different effects, and then that source with all the different effects going through different effects. So simply layering layers. I'll give a quick example of how it sounds when all textures are in and playing around a bit with it. During the performance, I did this much slower with more attentiveness to the sound. And being in the real space, you get a much better sense of the movement of sound and how you can control how you feel the music while playing. Now for the sensory percussion part, I made different sounds for each song. And how I mapped it was the right drum was more like low sounds, like bass drums or low frequency stuff, and the left side was more high pitched stuff, so cymbals, noise, snares, stuff like that. For some songs, what I did is I put some melodic content in the drums. So let's say for this song, on my right side there's a bass note plus the kick, and then on the left side I sequence some piano notes in the center, and on the edge you have higher pitched or an octave higher piano notes also. And this would be combined with the textures from the modular synth to create a piece. My goal with this was to have more material to improvise with. So if I wanted and felt it in the moment, I could simply start with sensory percussion and start building and then bring in textures from the synth. Or if I wanted, I could have started with the synth, establish some sort of drone pattern in the space and play around with the textures and effects, and then bringing the drums. So each piece didn't really have sections or anything predetermined. I really wanted it to be improvised in the moment. And so I needed each element to work together, but also have enough control over everything so I can decide the form while I'm playing. For the controller, what was happening is that I had effects on the two effects ends of sensory percussion, and I was sending the drums with the knobs of the controller. The effects were always panned at the top with rapid movement, while the kick and snare or the more basic sounds were at the base of the dome, slowly moving around, almost static. Even at high speeds, it was almost static, but the effects were very quick. All these samples I made myself. I sampled some Morfbeats instrument. I sampled my 48-inch steel ride. I sampled my own drums. I really created sounds for this performance in particular. I think that sums it up pretty much for my setup and the sounds. So in short, it really was my modular synth with not many sound sources, but multiplied through effects. And then that modular synth was multiplied through different effects in Ableton. Each effect has a trajectory in space, and my Midi controller decides the gain of that trajectory, turning it on and off, and decides the speed, throwing it in the dome. And then in parallel to this, I have sensory percussion, which both have either drums or harmonic content. This is also spaced out through the space because each left and right was viewed as two different trajectories, often with the LFO on the pan so that it would jump from one to another, with effects at the top, big drums at the bottom, and the MIDI controller not controlling much except the FX end. This going into the final mixing software. This was given to the technician at the dome and was pushed in real life. So that's it. I thank you for watching this video. I hope it was informative and interesting to you. I'd like to give a special thank you to everyone at the Société des Arts Technologiques for inviting me to play this and giving me the opportunity to play with the movement of sound in such a space. It was really a good experience for me and made me learn a lot. I hope to do it again. I will be able to post the full performance online soon, and if ever you have any questions, just leave a comment below. So that's it. Have a nice day.